Hi, welcome to St Bryce, Kirk for another of our Yes events leading up to the referendum in September. My name is Marie Penman and I'm a volunteer with Yes Scotland. We are delighted to have with us tonight one of the legends of activism and public speaking, Tariq Ali, who's come all the way up from London just to speak to us in Kirkcaldy, so we should feel honoured. Tariq is going to speak to us for about 30 minutes. And that'll be followed by a Q&A when you'll be able to ask any questions that you want from him. So if he says anything during his talk that you'd particularly like to ask about, try and keep a note of it or remember it. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to have an introduction given by one of our campaigners, Dr. Bob Purdy. And Bob is in fact the reason that Tariq is in Kirkcaldy tonight, because they have been friends for almost 50 years. And Bob invited Tariq to come and speak in Kirkcaldy because he is interested in the independence campaign and in Scotland's prospects as an independent country. So I'm going to hand you over to somebody who knows Tariq a lot better than I do, because I just met him 10 minutes ago. So please welcome Dr. Bob Purdy.
It's a real pleasure to welcome my old friend Tariq to Kirkcaldy. I've known Tariq since 1968. I met him through the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, and then I went down to London in 1968. I left Kirkcaldy wearing my Bob Dylan cap with the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign badge in the middle. And I wrote for Tariq's paper, The Red Mall, and those years were just enormous fun. Tariq was always great company. But I wanted to tell you a couple of things about Tariq which aren't generally known about his political stances he's taken, which make his stance now on the Scottish question consistent. I remember walking home from work and seeing the newspaper placards that Czechoslovakia had been invaded by the Warsaw Pact. I immediately rang Tariq and he told me there was a demonstration at the Soviet embassy. I went down there and Tariq was there with a huge placard and gave a very moving speech about how we would support the Czechoslovak people against this oppression. The newspapers then criticised him for attacking the Americans, what the Americans were doing in Vietnam, and said nothing about this. And they attacked him for criticising the Americans in Vietnam and for not saying anything about Czechoslovakia. Nothing changes. Another instance is that when Bangladesh was created, West Bengal, which was part of Pakistan, broke away because of misgovernment from West Pakistan, and there was a civil war. Tariq, who's West Pakistani, organised a group of West Pakistanis for self-determination for West Bengal. Again, the newspapers said nothing about that. And other newspapers also used to write about Tariq in those days as being a rich playboy. He'd been president of the Oxford Union, so obviously he was some kind of bullion clubs type. Well, I remember when we were both broke. I was slightly more broke than he was, and he bought me a meal. And that is an indication of Tariq's generosity, which is why when I asked him to come to Kirkcaldy, I knew that if he could possibly do it, he would come. And also because he has had long associations with Scotland. I think he'll say something about that. When I was in the London branch of the SNP, he did the Immortal Memory for us twice. When I first met him, he was just back from Vietnam, where he was involved with the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation War Crimes Tribunal. And one of the people he worked with there, became his friend, was that great Fife man, Lawrence Daly, the miners' leader. And since the Yes campaign started, Tariq has been a consistent supporter. He's spoken at meetings in other places in Scotland. He gave lectures in Edinburgh and Glasgow. You can see them on YouTube. Edinburgh in the afternoon, Glasgow in the evening. Both speeches were completely different. So you always get from Tariq what he wants to say to you about the issues that are important to him. And the issue of Scottish independence is important to him, and he's very, very generously agreed to come up to Kirkcaldy to speak to us this evening. So please welcome Tariq.
Thanks very much, Bob, for the kind words and the memories. But I think one of the things our generation can do, not that I'm saying you've done it, is to think too much about the past when there's a future ahead. And this is why Scotland is extremely important. Now, many people ask, including young people in Edinburgh and Glasgow when I spoke there at meetings, why are you supporting us? And I said, I'm supporting you out of principle. But I'm also supporting you to show that this is not simply a campaign that involves Scots and English people. It is more international than that, because the international context in which the struggle for Scottish independence is taking place is very, very different from anything that we saw in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. The world has changed, and the world is in a mess, and this, of course, includes the United Kingdom. Not just the United Kingdom, it also includes the bulk of Europe. I mean, Europe is ill. We can see that in the fights taking place within the European elites as to which way Europe should go, who should be its president of the Commission. Should it be Juncker? Should it be someone else? Should it be decided on the basis of the largest parties, etc., etc.? So the question of democracy is at the center now of the debate on Europe. Economically, as we have seen, there's been a huge economic crisis, which was only solvable, and it's a crisis that was not predicted by anyone, left or right. It was not predicted by the financial papers who follow these things closely. Neither the Financial Times nor the Economist predicted it. Martin Wolf in the FD, who prides himself on knowing the system very well, did not predict it. And yet the system came very close to a total collapse. Had it not been for the state in the United States of America and the European states and their banking systems and their taxpayers' money, they would not have been able to pull out. So ultimately, when the system collapsed, the state had to bail it out with taxpayers' money. This is something we are told is not permitted when it comes to so many other things for which there is no money at all, or so we are told. But when it comes to bailing out their own system or going to war, there is no shortage. And given the democratic deficit that exists both on the continent and in each of the countries, why shouldn't Scotland be independent? What is there to fear? I mean, it's not that they're leaving something that is sort of completely prosperous without any problems at all and committing suicide. Far from it. In countries with smaller populations, it is sometimes far easier to promote democracy, to get people interested in what is going on, and even today. I mean, just because of this debate, I have no idea who's going to win. I know who I want to win, but I have no idea whether there will be independence. But what is undeniable is that the debate taking place in this country is like nothing else in the United Kingdom. I've traveled here, it's lively, In Glasgow, there were lots of questions to me from no campaigners, some of whom were nervous about what could happen or what might not happen. And so it's very interesting that people can get aroused by this. Of course, what they're getting aroused by is not something ordinary. Scottish independence would be a huge step forward, in my opinion, because it would then put Scotland out of the United Kingdom and into the world. And that is something that has to be understood. This is not an isolationist campaign. This is not a campaign which is sort of promotes cultural nationalism in that old sense. This is not a campaign in which the anti-English talk is coming from the politicians and the campaigners who are fighting for Scottish independence. This is not a campaign in which the leaders of the Yes campaign and their supporters are saying that Scotland is going to be ethnically cleansed. This is not a campaign in which migrants are being attacked. Far from it, exactly the opposite. So, what is wrong with this campaign? Nothing. I think it should be waged more vigorously. I know the SNP leaders are busy running the country, but as we approach September, I hope the priority is campaigning, going and meeting people, making sure people register and vote. What will a Scottish independent Scotland be like? There's a good example not too far away from here, which is the Norwegian example. It's another country that discovered oil, another country that built its own social economic system, a country where education and health are regarded as extremely important, a country in which there is very little unemployment. And Norway detached itself from Sweden in 1905 after a vote in the Swedish Parliament. And relations between the two countries improved. Everyone in Sweden and Norway tells you that. Which is why I was very interested and pleased to see that a number of Swedish and Norwegian writers and intellectuals had published a letter in, I think, the Herald, Sunday Herald here, pointing out that there was nothing to be frightened of and that they were looking forward to good relations with Scotland. So this is not a case of Scotland breaking off relations with the rest of the world, but actually improving relations with the rest of the world and establishing direct links with, say, the Scandinavian countries, trade links with other parts of the world, unmediated by Westminster and London. That's the first point. The second point, occasionally one reads in some of the less intelligent newspapers, which alas is a majority, that relations with England will suffer, this will happen, that will happen, forebodings of disasters to come. But why? Why? This is not a struggle being waged unconstitutionally. It's a campaign in which the Scottish people are going to decide, and if they go for independence, why would they want to break off relations with anyone, leave alone their neighbours with whom they've lived for a long time, intermarriages, people of Scottish origin living in Britain, vice versa. It's not going to be what it's pointed out to be. As to the question of the economics of it, as Gordon Brown discussed here not so long ago, to which replies have already been made by the Yes campaigners. But in my opinion, if there was proper discussion, there's no reason why Scotland could be effective social democratic country like Norway. Absolutely no reason at all. The campaign that is being waged against independence is not based on facts as much as on fear. Clearly, the unionist parties, Conservative, Labour, and Lib Dem, have decided that the way to win the vote is to frighten Scottish people. And they are playing on this. Your pensions this will happen to them, that will happen. Very similar things, by the way, that they did in a completely different context when there was a danger of Greece electing a Syriza government. The entire leadership of Europe went and scared the life out of the Greek people. Who will pay your pensions? There won't be enough, don't have enough money to pay for medicines. The pharmaceuticals will stop supplying the chemists' shops. So this has been tried out in another country, much, much worse off than Scotland. And in the recent European elections, Syriza became the largest party in Greece. So fear works up to a point, but beyond that, it's difficult to frighten people permanently. You know, you can do it some of the time. And in my opinion, there's no reason to be frightened. Of course, it seems difficult. It seems difficult because two nations rather, that have lived together within the framework of a common state, it's not easy, it's a wrench. To break from that state after a reasoned, passionate debate has not happened before in this form. I mean, I know that the Catalans in Spain are also discussing this, saying they don't want to be ruled from Madrid. In their case, this economic situation is different because they're an incredibly wealthy part of the Spanish Federation. But still, 57% of those parties that want independence got 57% of the vote combined in the last European elections. So there is a mood, and one reason for this mood is globalization, turbocharged capitalism, what it has done, and people believing, rightly so, that they have less and less control of their lives and of their politicians. I mean, I have to be honest with you. It is at the moment extremely depressing living in the English section of the United Kingdom. It's depressing because it's a land without an opposition. There is no opposition in Westminster. What you have, what I have often described it as in recent years, and not just in Britain, but in other parts of Europe, is that you have an extreme centre, which has a centre right, which has a centre, and which has a centre left. But it is all now effectively one because they agree with each other on all fundamentals. That agreement on fundamentals makes people believe, correctly, that they are living in countries where no opposition is possible. And those who then remained tribally attached to these parties of the extreme centre and can't put up in opposition to them express shock and horror when groups on the far right suddenly get large numbers of votes. I mean, if you look at the campaigning done by the Front National in France, Marine Le Pen's campaigning, of course there was the usual Islamophobia, there was the attack now and again on migrants, but the central basis of her appeal to the French people, and she more or less said it, was the old French white working class. And she said, these politicians and the global elites, especially the elites in Europe, are wrecking us. This is how much the cost of living is. They're privatizing everything. This is the right talking, the far right. They're privatizing everything. And we will take back from the privatizers those things that are absolutely necessary for the health of our country. And she talked about water, electricity, the utilities. I mean, it's very radical. It's very radical, but this used to be the program of traditional social democracy all over Europe. It's because they have abandoned that program completely and become globalizers that these groups can get away with it. The Dutch far right say the same thing. Farage is a different case in point. I mean, his plan is very simple. He wants to take over the Tory party effectively. And the way he fights his campaigns is to push politicians more and more towards him, not just Tories, but Labour. I mean, the Tories, it's not so difficult for him because half of that parliamentary party agrees with much of what he says. But when you have the Labour leader talking about immigration in that way, as the son of two migrant refugees, one from Belgium and one from Poland, then you begin to see the unpleasant side of what is going on in English politics and in European politics at the moment. This is not the case in Scotland. The SNP, under its current leadership, is not the SNP that was created in the 1920s or the SNP of the 1950s. This is an SNP which basically began to grow in the 1970s, when my friend Tom Nairn wrote his famous book, The Breakup of Britain, in 1977, a book that got me seriously interested in Scotland. And it's a book which said that Scotland should go for independence at a time when hardly anyone was thinking about it, and the analysis he provided was very prescient. He said the British state is decaying. It is in a state of decay at a time when that wasn't obvious to most people. Well, what wasn't obvious in the mid-70s is very obvious today. And that was a very strong and powerful book. And many other essays that he and the late Stephen Maxwell, a very important figure, intellectual in Scottish life and politics, wrote, and others are still writing today. I just saw a book by James Mitchell on a new book which has just come out today on Scotland, which obviously I haven't read, but I was looking through it. So there is an intellectual life in Scotland which is closely linked to the political and social life of the country. And that has traditionally been the case when progressive nationalisms have moved forward, that they have had a strong intelligentsia with them. Now, if you ask, why did Scotland miss out when the rest of Europe was developing nation states in the 19th century? The answer is very simple, that Scotland, the Scottish elites, were integrated with the British Empire. I mean, just as a footnote, one of my fondnesses for kilts and the bagpipes is that as a kid growing up in Lahore, in Pakistan in the 50s, at big events, we always used to have a whole band consisting of soldiers, an army band, with the Punjabi soldiers dressed in kilts and playing bagpipes, so the music is very familiar to us. And that's where I first heard bagpipes as a 10-year-old at a big event in Lahore in Pakistan. So it stayed with me because we used to hear it quite regularly, and all the tunes would be very familiar to you. So the Scottish involvement, participation in the British Empire staved off any desire to have a separate nation state in a period where other countries in Europe were developing it. And so the Scotland of that period, as symbolized by Walter Scott, who was a Tory unionist, was very different. And many people thought that that would never change. And the position occupied by conservative unionism in the 70s and 80s was taken over by Labour. And Labour became a party here, very tribal, and under New Labour, of course, it was sort of so noticeable. I remember once going into the Scottish Parliament about 8 or 9 years ago and seeing people working. And I said to a friend who had taken me there, I said, is that where the Tories are? And in fact, an old Tory who was with me at university, who suddenly said, what are you doing here? I hope you're not carrying a bomb. That was Lord James Douglas Hamilton, who had been with me at university. I said, no, are those all your guys sitting there? He said, no, that's New Labour. I said, well, they could be yours. Because honestly, the body language, the political talk, no different. No different. Defending the same consensus, no alternatives available that had been established by Margaret Thatcher. So that consensus, two things I think happened to shift public opinion in Scotland in a very, very sharp way. One was the oil, no doubt about it. Whether people said it in so many words, some did, not many, because it seemed greedy to say it, but the feeling was that this was Scotland's oil, and it was being squandered by an English Tory government to buy off voters in the Midlands. Unlike the Norwegians, who put their oil to very good use to benefit their country. That was the first. The second was New Labour, which people here, totally committed to the Labour Party for a long, long time, found it very difficult to take. Third, of course, was the development of a Scottish National Party, which was effectively social democratic and on many issues to the left of New Labour. And these three things combined created a new atmosphere in Scotland. It's, as we can see, nothing is settled as yet, but it is something that could take the people by surprise, the world by surprise. The only thing is this, that whatever else happens after the referendum on the 15th, I don't think there's any going back to the status quo ante. That is not going to happen, even because A, it's going to be a very close vote. B, if the no voters win, they will know it was a close call, and there's no going back. And the impetus for another referendum will grow and grow and grow, particularly if there is a Tory, UKIP, or whatever coalition in Britain next year. So I don't think this is a question that is going to go away. And I think what really needs to be done, it's very interesting what happened in the referendums on the European Constitution in a number of European countries, especially France, one of the core countries in the European Union, that the politicians who had signed a constitution that they had barely read were confronted by a population, including many of their own supporters, who had not only read the constitution but critiqued it. And every town, every district, every small town, every village had a meeting to discuss the European Constitution. And what they hated was that in this Constitution, central was the fact that the system, economic system, was neoliberalism or the modern capitalism, whatever you want to call it, People didn't like that being put into a constitution because they said this virtually seals off the possibility of any alternatives. And they defeated the constitution despite the fact that every single French newspaper and television network was for voting for. They defeated it because people ultimately, when they're taking things seriously, can do it. And I think that could happen here, by the way. I don't think it's impossible. And that is why meetings big and small to persuade, to discuss, to argue, to convince people who are not convinced, to tell elderly people who are worried their pensions might disappear. These are very important things in the run-up to the campaign that takes place. I'm very sad we've lost one of the great Scottish writers, Ian Banks, you know, in the last year. He was a tremendous campaigner and supporter of the idea of an independent Scotland, and worth 20 or 30 Voldemorts. So there's everything to play for. You know, I don't know whether there's been, I know there have been debates on television and radio, but I would have thought that, you know, big public debates between both sides would also be in order, because that's how people who are not committed decide, by listening. And on television, often, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, I think, is a huge asset and is very good, but it's always limited time. Whereas if there are huge meetings in all the Scottish towns, big and small, debates, public debates between the campaigns, everything is to be gained. Everything to be gained, because their arguments are extremely weak. And every time they've tried to frighten things, they've moved in the other direction. Now, I was quite interested to see President Obama entering the fray. I mean, this is a gent who I think has very little idea of Scotland or Scottish history, but clearly someone in 10 Downing Street was panicked enough to think that it was going to be, it was too comfortable, it was too uncomfortable to just depend on the voters. And why not get the American president to, and he of course said it would be, you know, awful if Britain were to break up, but why? I mean, it's not the case that Britain does anything without asking American permission. That will carry on. I mean, when have they done that? The last time they did that was in 1956 at Suez. And they were treated to insulting barrackroom language by the US president, and they never did it again. The Falklands enterprise couldn't have taken place without American support, and the Americans organized General Pinochet in Chile to back it as well. So, what is this big threat to the world's security if Britain does this? I mean, you know, they can have the missiles, which are in any case supplied by the United States, somewhere on the Thames or the sea, I don't know. But there is no real threat. Where's the threat? Who is threatening security? An independent Scotland? Why? Does an independent Latvia threaten it? An independent Estonia? None of these Baltic states, all smaller than Scotland. So it's two standards. The British state has to be kept together, but the old Soviet state has to be broken up as rapidly as possible. But why? I mean, I know why. It's the old Cold War thing. But it doesn't make sense to me in today's world where the entire Western leaders acknowledge that the main enemy is a bunch of Islamic terrorists. So they invade country after country and increase their numbers. As we've seen in Iraq. I mean, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq under Saddam. It's about to take the country over today, backed by Saudi Arabian money and weaponry. You know, and the Saudis are the one of the closest allies of Washington. So it's a weird, strange world. And in this world, given there are enough things to worry about, the Middle East is in a terrible state. A military dictatorship back in Egypt, Libya breaking up, Iraq breaking up, threatened with civil war, Afghanistan still in a mess, drone attacks taking place, but Scottish independence could pose a threat to the security of the United States. I mean, come on. It's just a foolish, thoughtless argument that came out of the White House to bag Cameron. Obviously, he went and begged and said, please, a little bit of support would be friendly. But I mean, it's been counterproductive, I think. Every time they behave like this, it's counterproductive. Now, what a number of theorists, political scientists have been arguing that democracy and capitalism of this sort cannot coexist permanently, and that capitalism is winning out and democracy is losing. They are not people on the left by any means who are saying that this is a real danger which is being underestimated. I think that is true. As I pointed out, my own formula of the extreme center says virtually the same thing. I mean, the danger is the movements to the far right, which use the crisis to target migrants. In the French, it's Maghrebians, but in Britain, interestingly enough, it's other Europeans. So either don't go into the common market, because anyone who joined the European community knew that one of the things that they had accepted when they signed the treaty was the free movement of labor from other European countries. I mean, it's normal. So why attack the Polish migrants or the Romanians, you know? And you have these grotesque scenes in England where after Romania joins something or the other within Europe, politicians turn up at Luton Airport to see how many migrants are pouring in. I mean, this is not just Tories, this is Labour as well. Turn up at Luton to see how many Romanians are going to come off this plane to try and beat the tabloids at their own game, which is fatal. Once politicians and political parties start doing that, they go down. Naturally, there wasn't, I think there was one Romanian who was just coming back because he lived in Britain. So far from there being this huge influx, there was in fact not that much, but that, you know, to even argue like this in reality is sort of debasing somehow, because that's not the real debate. The real debate is, why are you in Europe if this is the way you're going to behave? I mean, I know there are huge problems with Europe, and I believe that one has to campaign to democratize Europe if we can. But if in the English referendum on the Europe there's a vote to come out, that's another reason for Scotland to be independent. So that someone from these islands is represented in the European community. That's my opinion. Not to, you know, become the slaves of the European elite, but to fight and argue for a different version of Europe. So the democratic argument, I think, is the strongest one for an independent Scotland. That it'll be far easier and better to involve people in the running of the state at different levels of society, and people will feel freer to put pressure on their government to change course if they are a small country. I mean, one sees this in some of the smaller countries in Europe and elsewhere. So I think that these are important reasons that should be argued for This is not, we're not in the middle of a national liberation struggle as many colonial countries were in the 30s. Scotland is not a colonial country and has not been since it was integrated into the British Empire. That was the basis of the unionism. That empire is finished. The reason Britain plays a role in world politics is courtesy of the United States. There is only one empire in the world today, and that is the United States. And one can't ignore that fact. It's there, it exists, and one has to deal with it as best one can, as people in different parts of the world do. But the notion that any of this, the crisis, necessitates the United Kingdom, I don't agree with at all. I think also, if I can conclude on this, that an independent Scotland might, interestingly enough, be better for England as well. Why? Because it will create a huge debate. There's no way British politics or English politics or Welsh and English politics, whatever you want to call it, will be the same if Scotland goes independent. It might actually force a debate, a serious debate, inside the Labour Party itself, that we've got to stop operating like zombies and start talking to real people and start attempting to draw real people into our party. Or hopefully new parties will emerge. Not the Farage types, but parties, progressive parties, or party in England, which will fight for, at the very least, a democratic electoral system. So the first past the post system is corrupt, totally corrupt. It's not democratic. Doesn't reflect popular opinion on the day the votes are cast. It's a trick. So these things will be and could be of benefit. And Scotland, in that sense, could teach a few things to its English counterparts. Far from being hostile, it could become a similar situation as which existed in Scandinavia at the beginning of the last century. A lot to look forward to, and there's a lot to hope for, and especially for the younger generation in Scotland, young people in their late teens, in their 20s, it could actually be a totally different way for you to look at your country than has hitherto been possible. Because have no doubt about it, an independent Scotland, with all the problems that might exist, will transform your lives, the way you look at your country, the way you look at your fellow citizens, and the way you relate to the world. Thank you.